Today's speaker, Dr. Jeff Ferrell, is currently on the faculty in the Department of Criminal Justice at Texas Christian University. He earned his master's and doctoral degrees in sociology from the University of Texas at Austin. He's also been on the sociology faculty at Northern Arizona University and Regis University in Denver, and has been a visiting professor at Southern Methodist University and Richmond College in London. His ninth book, entitled Empire of Scrounge, is scheduled for release this year by New York University Press, and several of his earlier publications were published by Northeastern University Press. His vita mentions over 80 articles, essays, reviews, and book chapters. He is the founding editor of the Alternative Criminology series for New York University Press, and is also founding editor of a journal entitled Crime, Media, Culture, and International Journal. And he mentions 7 published photographs also in his list of accomplishments. Jeff has received numerous honors for his teaching and research, including having one of his books entitled Cultural Criminology nominated for the American Society of Criminology's Michael J. Hindling Award, recognizing the most outstanding contribution to criminology. In 1998, he was named Critical Criminologist of the Year by the Critical Criminology Division of the American Society of Criminology, and in 2001, his book entitled Tearing Down the Streets, Adventures in Urban Anarchy, was nominated as the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences Outstanding Book of the Year. Jeff mentions over 26 different classes that he's taught during his career. I'm going to mention the titles of only those that I think will best introduce today's particular presentation. The title of these classes include Criminology, Crime and the Media, Urban Popular Culture, Origins and Developments of Sociological Thought, Qualitative Methods, Ethnomethodology, and Cultural Criminology. For our doctoral students, just to keep this in mind, I want to remind you that this is true of virtually all of our Beto Chair lecturers, that Jeff's work qualifies him as a correct answer on doctoral comprehensive exams, both in the criminology and in the research methods sections. If you Google Jeff Ferrell, you get over 370,000 hits. If you Google George Beto, you get about 130,000 hits. And so, arguably, our lecturer today is more popularly known than the person who's honored by the name of this particular series. For whatever it's worth, just for perspective, if you Google Dennis Longmire, you get 13,000 hits. And if you Google Richard Ward, our dean, you get almost 7 million hits. But the first one is for a virtual salon where you can get virtual hairdos and virtual makeovers and virtual wardrobe recommendations. And it takes 9 pages before you get to our Richard Ward. Today, Dr. Jeff Ferrell will talk to us about detonating the cultural in cultural criminology, and tomorrow at 1:30 he will present Empires of Alternative Meaning. Please turn off your cell phones and any other electronic devices that might disturb the people sitting around you. Hold questions until the end, unless Jeff invites you to do otherwise. And remember that there will be a reception immediately following the presentation in the alumni room, which is over there, immediately after the presentation. Please join me in welcoming speaker, Dr. Jeff Ferrell.
Thank you, Dennis. Dennis, thank you very much for a very kind introduction, and I appreciate that very much. It's an honor to be here. All of us in criminology and criminal justice think very highly of Sam Houston's undergraduate and graduate programs. Dennis and I were talking before the lecture began about the quantity and quality of doctoral students at Sam Houston, many of whom I've come to know as colleagues in other universities. And so, again, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to be able to address you. As was suggested, I want to talk today about cultural criminology, which has emerged in the past 10 years or so as a sort of corrective, perhaps, to conventional criminology or a counter-discourse on crime and control. In brief, cultural criminology emphasizes the centrality of meaning and representation in the construction of crime as a momentary event, as a subcultural endeavor, and as a social issue. From this view, the appropriate subject matter of criminology then transcends traditional notions of crime and crime causation to include images of illicit behavior, symbolic displays of law enforcement, popular culture constructions of crime and criminal action, and the edgy emotions that animate criminal events, people's perceptions of criminal threat, and even public efforts at crime control. This wider focus, cultural criminologists argue, allows scholars and the public alike to better understand crime as meaningful human activity and to penetrate more deeply the contested politics of crime and crime control. So the notion that has been developed over the past decade or so in cultural criminology is that in a world driven by and saturated by images and by symbolic displays, we as criminologists must encounter these and engage with them on a fairly sophisticated level in order to understand why crimes are committed, again, our dependent variable, in order to understand what crime control policies work and don't work, this sort of notion. Now, a little bit of background on where this came from. At a fundamental level, cultural criminology has emerged out of the integration of sociological criminology, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, and I'll give you a very brief overview of that, with the field of cultural studies. And in particular, two traditions have come together over the past 20 or 30 years to form in the last decade this perhaps new paradigm that we're calling cultural criminology. The first of these is the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies in Great Britain and what in the 1970s was called the New Criminology. In Great Britain around this time, cultural theorists, criminologists, sociologists, media scholars began to reconceptualize the nature of power and control, to look at social class not just as an economic factor, but as a matter of lifestyle, symbolism, and display, to look at policing again, not simply as policing bodies or activities, but policing as a display of control meant for the consumption of certain audiences, be that politicians or the public or the voting public, this sort of thing. And so in Great Britain in the 1970s and through the early 80s, again, a paradigmatic shift in terms of how power was understood and the connection between power control and criminal justice, rethinking what social class was, how class connected to crime, and how social control operated on the streets and in the political and economic realms. That's one of the foundations of what has become cultural criminology. The other one is an American foundation, which is also in the 1970s. There emerged out of long-standing intellectual traditions new versions of symbolic interactionism as applied to crime and justice. And of course, the most prominent of these in those days was labeling theory, which also began to spawn a series of case studies and ethnographies designed to get at the contested meaning of crime and crime control. And so perhaps you can see the similarity. While the British scholars were working on the contested meaning of crime and policing at a broad social level, intellectually, theoretically, American scholars were beginning to do case studies based on the labeling insight that is not what one did so much as how what one did was reacted to, that is constructed it as crime or deviance. And so in both, across the Atlantic, on both sides, 20 or 30 years ago, there was increasingly a notion that crime was not a given, but was a culturally constructed category, and that policing and control also involved symbolism, display, representation, as much as they simply involved, again, controlling people's bodies or actions. As these two orientations co-evolved and came together, each of them informed the other. American interactionists and ethnographers took from British criminology and British cultural studies sophisticated understandings of crime and control and social power. The British scholars, we now look back and understand, took from the American tradition a willingness to engage with criminal subcultures, to do deep ethnography, and to explore the phenomenological foreground of crime and justice. And so either of these, I think, would be valuable. Put together, you ended up with a fairly sophisticated ability to penetrate both the immediate moments of crime and contextualize that within larger social, political, economic frameworks. In 1995, as was mentioned, I and Clinton Sanders published a book, Cultural Criminology, where for the first time we tried to theorize this and bring these two traditions together overtly, and we had the audacity to call this a new tradition, to call this cultural criminology. And so this began to then spawn other work over the last decade or so that then brought in deconstructionist and postmodern sensibilities, looking at the looping circulation of images at how representation forms a sort of hall of mirrors, where increasingly in a world driven by the internet and mass media and 24/7 communication, we're not only looking at representations of something else, we're often looking at representations of representations. Again, a kind of hall of mirrors where one image or style or symbol plays off another between the police and criminals, between the public and the courts, between politicians and the judiciary. And so we begin to bring these traditions into the modern or postmodern world and see that increasingly we had to account for not just images and representation, but how those images informed each other and often led to policy changes, public panics over crime, that sort of thing. The methods for which cultural criminology in the last decade has become famous for some and infamous for others, also emerge out of these traditions, and I've been geared largely toward ethnography. Certainly, if you read the work in cultural criminology, semiotic analysis, textual analysis, visual analysis is used, but the work that has been most prominent has been deep ethnography, has been cultural criminologists, again, taking the sensibility of trying to examine style and meaning and symbolism with them into the field and penetrating deeply into criminal worlds, and in some cases, worlds of policing, the subcultures of policing, this sort of thing. This has been driven by two theoretical notions. In part, this has been driven by the notion that subcultures, criminal and deviant subcultures, are not just collectivities of people, but are collectivities of meaning and symbolism, and that they're often held together and defined by shared styles, symbols, representational practices, rituals, this sort of thing. And without becoming part of that world, those practices are largely incomprehensible. And so to understand the nature of crime and understand why crime is perpetuated among criminals, the notion was we have to take this understanding of symbolism and style inside those worlds, become part of them, and learn the situated meaning of criminality in that way. The second drive behind this notion of doing deep ethnography has come out of the work of Jack Katz and Stephen Ling and others, which is a sort of ideology of crime that suggests that crime is in part formed in the moment it happens, that the meaning and symbolism of crime takes shape in what Katz calls the foreground of crime, that later on crime statistics or research reports or books may capture the echoes of that, but there is a sort of visceral, emotional intensity to criminal events for the victims, for the perpetrators, for control agents, for police officers, during a robbery, during a moment of domestic violence, during a gang fight. Something's going on there that can't be captured unless one is co-present and able to get a sense of those emotions and what symbolic practices are taking shape in that moment. So that's also driven cultural criminologists to the notion that, and I do in a sense use the word driven, in some ways beyond our own best judgment, that we have to immerse ourselves as deeply as possible in the situated symbolism of criminality and policing and crime control. Such experiences have also been focused on because another sort of paradigmatic shift that cultural criminology has proposed is to look not just at spectacular criminality or crimes that make the headlines, but at everyday criminality as the site of politics, resistance, meaning, sexuality, gender, ethnicity, that much of our daily life is negotiated, cultural criminologists argue, not through simply the most violent crimes, the most high-profile crimes, but through the sort of microscopic criminality of everyday life. And tomorrow I'll talk about some ethnographies I've done into sort of everyday criminality. Cultural criminologists argue that these crimes, while often characterized in certain theories that I'll allude to as mundane or rational, in fact often embody aspects of risk, excitement, pleasure, and therefore animate people's lives in ways that their work, perhaps, or their family, or even other kinds of recreation don't. And that it's this tension between daily control and the animation of daily life by deviance and pleasure that in some ways explains contemporary controversies. For example, the aggressive policing of alternative subcultures and their styles by school officials, juvenile officials, police officers, and others. The mediated consumption of crime as a sort of commodified titillation and entertainment. It is remarkable to the extent to which our culture is addicted to crime and policing as pleasure, as something to consume in novels and television programs and movies. And always the shifting and contested boundaries between art and pornography, music and political provocation, entertainment and aggression, crime and resistance. That these boundaries are negotiable and contested partly because what we see again in everyday life is an attempt to sort out the boundary between crime and deviance on one hand and everyday experience and control on the other. So while exploring these everyday worlds in cultural criminology, because largely, to be honest, of the British tradition of doing grand theory about meaning and symbolism and doing political theory, there's also been an attempt over the past 10 years in cultural criminology to locate these everyday studies in larger social, political, and economic patterns. For example, in a world shaped by endless circulation of images and symbols, conventional dualities of the real and the representational, as I mentioned a minute ago, seem to make less and less sense. And so cultural criminologists emphasize the permeability of images and the flow of images between criminal subcultures, the mass media, and the criminal justice system, and argue that if that were true in the 70s, it's even more true now. Following this notion, and I'll speak more about this a little bit later, there's been a notion that we have to investigate policing and criminal justice itself as a sort of public display. That increasingly what seems to happen is policing is put on display to be consumed by the public, and displays of deviance or crime are policed by control agents, so that everyone involved in some ways is engaged in a sort of theatrical moment of trying to offer their version of reality to consumers, being shoppers at a mall, voting public, politicians, etc. And one more focus as we try to blend the everyday with the global and the macro-social has been increasingly in cultural criminology an attempt to theorize the city. Those of you who are doctoral students know that many of the great works in criminology, the Chicago School and others, were blending criminological analysis with an attempt to understand the nature of the modern city. So what I've done in some of my work, and Keith Hayward and Michael Presney and others are trying to do, is to go back into theorizing urban existence and asking what about urban existence can be linked, again, in terms of culture, perception, everyday life, to particular kinds of criminality. And our notion is that in the contested cultural spaces of consumption and display that the big urban areas offer, there's an amalgam of illicit subcultural dynamics. There is spatial and symbolic practices going on that are policed and offered back and forth between subcultures and ethnic groups and social classes. And so the city becomes, in that sense, a sort of cauldron of contested meaning and symbolic displays. In all of this, human construction is emphasized. The notion in cultural criminology, and this perhaps is the most aggressive or perhaps dramatic point that cultural criminologists make, is that human meaning transcends its reduction to variables or data sets or statistical summaries, that it overwhelms in both its stylistic elegance and its symbolic nuance in the attempt to reduce what people do to traditional notions of social science. And so in this sense, cultural criminology has positioned itself as inherently humanistic, as essentially humanistic in emphasizing the human ability to construct both beauty and tragedy out of interaction and out of human symbolic displays and culture. And so to summarize this first part, within an ongoing, contested, changing symbolic environment, cultural criminologists argue the meaning of transgression and control, indeed the very boundaries between crime and politics, emerge out of human interaction, of an ongoing interplay of people, symbols, and emotions, both real and attributed by others. This process in turn unfolds within and between everyday worlds and larger social dynamics, and it's exactly this dynamic between the larger multimediated world and everyday life that has to be explored and perhaps contested if we're going to confront injustice and move toward a more just and less violent society. Cultural criminology argues that the meaning of crime and crime control is continually renegotiated by criminals, by victims, and by police officers, and as much so by public officials, television programmers, and criminologists. That in their contested human representation is their reality. It is in fact the uncertainty of meaning that defines what we do know for certain. Now, all of this, of course, is, as was suggested, in some ways subversive of dominant paradigms of understanding. This obviously is, whether intended to be or not, and sometimes it is and sometimes not, a subversion of the ability of public officials or criminal justice officials or even criminologists to make definitive statements about the nature of crime or the rate of crime or the causes of crime. It suggests instead that this is an ongoing process. But in the second part of this talk, I want to emphasize that there's something else perhaps even more subversive, and certainly for those of you who are majoring in or doing doctoral work in or master's work in criminal justice or criminology, this may, I think, be the more important point for you. And that is that there is a subversion not just of what we know about crime as activists or political figures or public officials, but it seems to me cultural criminology also subverts criminology itself. And that in that sense, it suggests that, to put it simply, that if style matters, that if aesthetics are important, if representation shapes the realities of those we study, then it seems we must recognize that these same factors shape and should shape the enterprise of criminology itself. To put it another way, if we embrace the essential importance of symbolic meaning in the worlds we study, shouldn't we, mustn't we, embrace its essential importance in our own scholarly worlds as well? So again, turning cultural criminology not just toward the world around us to explain crime, criminality, the failures and successes of social control, but turning this cultural insight, this notion about symbolism and style and meaning, back toward our own enterprise of being criminologists. If it is time to do that, then it does seem to me, and it does seem that it is time for that, then that would be what I would suggest by the title of Detonating the Cultural and Cultural Criminology. That is, letting cultural criminology explode not only as a new approach to crime and justice, but a new critique of and reconceptualization of what criminology itself is. So, for example, if we do turn that cultural lens back on ourselves, it seems that we can begin to acknowledge a revolution that's been underway for years now, but largely unrecognized, as a significant amount of work in criminology and other social sciences has in fact moved toward engagement with representational dynamics, symbolic discourse, and meaning and style. Just as a side note, because I've been on the program committee for ASC and ACJS for a number of years, it strikes me how often I notice that what once was a session on policing is now a session on media images of policing. What was once a session on domestic violence is now a session on images of domestic violence. That the subject matter of criminology seems to have shifted under our feet. That even traditional notions of what crime and justice entails seems now more often in our academic discourse, in our papers, our books, in our sessions at national conferences, to be sessions about the meaning or impression or representation of the subject rather than simply the subject itself. Perhaps as importantly, it seems that if we do begin to turn this cultural lens back on ourselves, recognize that much of the work in criminology and criminal justice, history, anthropology, sociology, has itself become more stylish, has itself drifted away from older notions of objectivity and old conventions of pseudoscientific research and toward more engaged, personal, and literary forms of communication. I do tend to work in a variety of fields, and I've noticed this, again, in all the fields within which I work, that less and less do we see conventional notions of social science, much less science. More we see literary styles being promoted, or autobiography, autoethnography, narrative, this sort of thing, becoming part of the sort of official discourse of many of our disciplines. It's certainly the case with cultural criminology. Cultural criminology has argued not only for engaging with meaning and symbolism and emotion in those we study, but for bringing our own emotions and symbols to bear as criminologists, as part of our research. And likewise, cultural criminology, to be honest, has its recent disciplinary emergence and ascendance seems clearly, to be frank, not just a matter of its subject matter, but a matter of the fact that cultural criminological books and articles tend themselves to be more stylish, more engaging, to involve more images, to involve perhaps better writing, and therefore to use the word that Katz would use, to seduce those who might otherwise disagree into familiarizing themselves with the subject matter. So again, I'll be honest here, an honest appraisal then from my view would be that we have seen a shift over the past 20 or 30 years in what we do toward both engagement with image and symbolism in those we study, and toward increasing awareness among ourselves that our own image and symbolism matters, that how we write, what photographs we take, what the cover of a book looks like, how well we lecture in class is part of what's going on. The medium in that sense is the message. It always has been, but it seems we're increasingly able, if we notice, to engage with that issue. In contrast, and I hope not to offend anyone, but I'll throw this out and feel free to disagree here in a minute. But in contrast, it seems to me, by standards of form or function, some mainstream social science is increasingly a failed project. Over the past century or so, it's not become more scientific in any conventional sense of experimental rigor or explanatory scope. And worse, the greater the effort in making social science scientific, the more systematic has been the dehumanization of research subjects, in many infamous cases I'm sure you're aware of, and the numeric abstraction of human experience. Confronting this failure, grasping for the illusion of scientific control, at least some criminologists have turned to hyper-specialization and linguistic obfuscation, apparently on the notion that their work's got to be good-looking if it's so hard to see. As a cultural perspective on this would imply, of course, this has spawned a social science culture, a set of symbolic codes that both embody and perpetuate the problem. And again, I apologize that this refers to some of my work, by the way, as well as others. Passive third-person writing, interruptive in-text referencing, big tables, long equations, and a general tyranny of the calculated number and the turgidly written word over the idea and the image. If style matters, then conventional criminology, or at least some parts of it, is in trouble. It is ugly, inhuman, boring, and therefore revealing. In response to this aesthetic, and by the way, to the increasing use of university review boards and granting agencies to enforce this aesthetic, of pseudoscientific social science culture. Howard Becker, one of the founders of modern criminology, now claims not to do research any longer, nor to do criminology. He says he now does conceptual art, that he simply immerses himself in situations and sees what emerges artistically. And why not conceptual art instead of social science? After all, the science and social science, it seems to me, as one trained in social science, has long functioned more as an anxious metaphor than accomplished reality. Rationality has hardly displaced emotion in the practice of human inquiry, despite our protestations of neutrality and objectivity. Little of our work goes forward under closely controlled conditions, nor could it if we're doing field work with criminals and police officers and others. And despite our protestations to the opposite, it seems that much of what we do is a matter of self-interest and careerism, although we often mask it in terms of objective social science. But like other metaphors, and those of you in this room would understand the power of metaphors like the war on drugs and the war on terror, the metaphor of social science continues to organize particular meanings and behaviors, many of them inappropriate to the subject of study. So along with conceptual art, what else might serve as a metaphor? If social science is more a metaphor than a reality, and yet a metaphor that's organized our approach, what else beside Becker's notion of conceptual art might be a better metaphor that would free us to do the kind of research that increasingly seems to need to be done? If by better we mean more honest, more liberating, more tolerant and inventive, more useful in critically engaging with contemporary issues of crime and crime control. I would propose two. First of all, we might think of what we do as jazz. Jazz, all good music, I would argue, as a musician, engages people in the same way we might hope criminology engages them. It produces transient moments of aesthetic excitement, moments in which technical virtuosity and training explode into improvisational insight. In so doing, it engages both its producers and its audience in an emergent collective process that carries their emotions and their intellects beyond taking for granted structures of understanding and control. That sounds to me like a good seminar, by the way, or a good book as well. So it seems to me, if we are scholars, part of what we want to do is take ourselves past where we thought we could go and take our students and readers and audiences there as well. And a good jazz improvisation, a good DJ in a nightclub does very much the same thing. Perhaps this is why the unregulated humanity of jazz and other innovative musical forms has so bothered those invested in domination and control. And in some research I did for a previous book, it turns out, by the way, not only the Nazis, but the communists as well were adamantly opposed to jazz, because jazz was subversive of control, state authority, certainty. So I therefore especially like jazz if it's that bothersome to authoritarians of all stripes. And perhaps this is also why many cultural criminologists, by the way, are musicians and do embrace music not only as a subject of study, but musical lyrics as a wellspring of analysis and model for a new kind of rhythmic writing. Joe Strummer, Billy Bragg, Bruce Springsteen, Sinead O'Connor, Steve Earle, Bob Dylan, Billie Holiday, NWA, Merle Haggard, Leadbelly, they sing insights into crime and control that we can only hope to emulate. And if as cultural criminologists we do strive to make music like they do, and like Thelonious Monk and Rage Against the Machine and Rancid, then maybe someday at some academic conference session, an audience member will respond the way Dee Moriarty responded to a jazz improvisation in the book On the Road, standing in the back and saying, "God, yes," and clasping his hands in prayer and sweating. But I doubt it. I doubt we can pull that off. So if we're not able to make music as criminologists in our research, what other metaphor? The final one I would suggest would be play. Weld into the very structure of Nazi death camps, if you know the history of the 20th century, inviting their arrivals into horrific efficiencies of forced labor was a slogan over the entry of every Nazi death camp, Arbeit macht frei, which it translates in a variety of ways, but among those translations is work will set you free or work makes you free. This was, of course, one of the world's most vicious lies, and I would argue it still is. These days, our political overseers are busy enough inscribing that kind of lie into our lives as scholars and researchers and writers through tenure and post-tenure review procedures, increasing teaching loads, metastasizing committees, and growing demands for outside funding. We need not inscribe those ourselves. In fact, I suggest you remember one of the more succinct slogans that emerged during the uprisings in Paris in 1968, "Never work," and try never to let our work become one more intellectual drudgery. Engaged as it is with symbolism and meaning and culture, cultural criminology perhaps offers a chance to be playful rather than to be simply engaged in drudgery. This sense of play, by the way, this refusal to push ourselves toward serious social science seems to me essential, not because cultural criminology and criminology as a whole doesn't matter, but because it does. If we want to disseminate and develop our understandings of crime and justice, which I think are essential to creating a better society, It seems to me we would do well to avoid the sort of deathly disengagement that now afflicts much of mainstream social science. Ongoing intellectual excitement and political engagement with the larger world will more likely come from an approach that defines itself in terms of music or play or carnival than one defined by its insularity and arrogance as a pseudoscience. Hectic, irreverent, transgressive, and above all fun, Jock Young's characterization of the old National Deviancy Conference that began all this in Great Britain aren't bad terms of engagement either. What is this black in black popular culture? What is this black in black popular culture? Stuart Hall once asked, famously, willing to crack the very foundations of the debate over ethnicity. Hall was saying that increasingly black popular culture was being studied and examined as a wellspring of creativity, of art, of music. But his point was, we assume black means black, and then we investigate popular culture. And Hall, in a famous essay, said, black doesn't just mean black. Black itself is a cultural category. To be black is not a matter of skin color. To be black is to be conversant with and to emerge from a long history of cultural resistance to white domination, to embrace traditions of slavery and African heritage, and he pointed out, especially to know what black style is. Hall said, being black is a matter of style. It's a matter of understanding the meaning and symbolism of your own life more than it's a matter of skin color. So Stuart Hall, himself a British African scholar, said, before we talk about culture, let's not just give away terms like black or white or rich or poor. Those are cultural constructions as well. So again, famously, Hall said, what is this black in black popular culture? Let's not move past that into an assumption that that's an essence, when in fact that itself is a cultural construction. It seems to me the value, or one possible value of cultural criminology, is that it asks the same kind of question. What is this cultural in cultural criminology? As with Hall, any answer must address not just our subject matter, but our own philosophic and aesthetic sensibilities as evidence of what is now going on in criminology. At its best, and it's not always at its best, but at its best, the cultural within cultural criminology denotes a sort of aesthetic manifesto about our own work as much as it does a new range of subject matter. It forms the canvas of representation on which a new kind of criminology might be imagined. While the cultural and cultural criminology certainly points to the cultural dynamics of crime and crime control, it also offers the cultural as a mode of appreciation, understanding, and communication. That is, an alternative philosophic foundation for criminology itself. Simply put, if cultural criminology suggests new substantive orientations for criminology, it also suggests new ways of doing criminology. We might hope that evocative writing, engaging images, and ethnographic particulars can make criminology a more vivid practice in the world, can make us more influential in terms of public policy and public perception, and therefore engage criminology more deeply and more successfully with the world we try to address. 3 decades ago, again, looking back at the foundations, in the new criminology, Nils Christie, who was here recently, was quoted by the authors of that book in a very interesting prescriptive passage. Nils Christie said, this is again 1974, I believe, he said, we have not made clear that our role as criminologists is not first and foremost to be problem solvers, but problem raisers. That our job is not to solve problems offered to us by society, but to raise problems about what's going on in society. And then in a passage that I found remarkably prescient in terms of what it suggested over the next 30 years, Christie went on to say, let us turn our weaknesses into strength by admitting and enjoying that our situation has a great resemblance to that of artists and people of letters. We are working on a culture of deviance and control. Changing times create new situations and bring us to new crossroads. Together with other cultural workers, because these fields are central to all observers and analysts of society, it is our obligation and our pleasure to penetrate modern problems. Christie was saying, instead of seeing social science as halfway to science, perhaps we should see social science as halfway to art and observation and photography and cultural inquiry, and embrace our failure to be scientists, and yet our success at being trained observers, writers, photographers, and speakers. 3 decades later, with cultural criminology seemingly now emerging as the next sort of new criminology, the medium remains the message, and the message remains the same. Abandoning the political and paradigmatic foundations of administrative criminology, embracing instead the orientation offered, as Christie suggested, by artists and writers and musicians and photographers, cultural criminology offers new possibilities for analysis and appreciation, and perhaps even a new aesthetic for critically confronting contemporary problems of crime and crime control. Thank you. I hope that might have generated some rebuttals or questions.
Understanding how we would look at criminology, if everything is a construct with a construct that explains it, can we ever get to the root of where we need to be, or if it's a construct within a construct?
Excellent question.
Repeat the question.
Based on how people learn, everything we use to define the experience in the world around us is going to be based on a social construct, which is based on a social construct, which is based on another one. Can we ever get to the beginning and really understand a phenomenon?
And there I would say you've addressed what many would characterize as sort of the modern versus postmodern turn in the social sciences, which, as you say, for centuries we thought that what we were doing was peeling away layers of unreality and false impression to get at the kernel of truth as to what caused crime or what the nature of gender was. It seems to me and certainly what cultural criminology suggests, is all we have are competing constructs. But that doesn't mean a kind of absolute relativism, because we can still certainly ask, in whose interest is that construction being made, and what does that construction serve crime policy well or not. And so in looking at how constructions play off one another and the politics of how images and representations emerge, it seems to me we do good critical analysis and might end up with actually better crime control policies and better understandings of crime, but not under the illusion that we can ever get rid of all the false ideas and get to the one true nugget of what's actually there. So I do think it is a sort of relativism, but not an absolute relativism, not a sense of throwing up your hands and saying, since nothing's real, why bother? But rather saying we need to look at the construction of reality and see, for example, that I would argue that the primary way in which power works right now is not jails and prisons, although there's still plenty of those, but instead the ability of powerful groups and organizations and people to construct the image of crime, to construct a sense of threat or panic. And that, I think, is what we need to address.
Can you just briefly touch upon some of the methodologies you use and what you have characterized as basically a humanistic endeavor as opposed to an empirical endeavor?
Yes.
And having employed those methodologies, how do you relate them to the very meaningful and concrete business of informing policy and those sorts of things that attend our discussion?
Excellent question. Well, first of all, I guess I would actually perhaps link humanistic and empirical. In other words, I would argue that I think what perhaps some of us are trying to do is to take a humanistic orientation into empirical research and say that if we don't penetrate the worlds of those we study and put ourselves on street corners, in situations, in alleys, in corporate boardrooms, then it's difficult to know the actual dynamics of what's going on there. Therefore, difficult to create policy that can possibly deal with the problems, reduce the level of violence, reduce the level of victimization. One thing I'll talk about tomorrow is that the ethnographies I did were certainly humanistic ethnographies in the sense of trying to see how human beings constructed the reality of their worlds, both the police officers and the people who were criminal or labeled as criminal. But also I think, I'll say somewhat immodestly, I think those ethnographies also showed why certain policies were failing, because policy had been made on the assumption this is what these folks were doing, when in fact that was not what motivated them or organized their behavior. So it seems to me that sort of humanistic empirical work, if paid attention to, if we can do it in a way that people hear it, and especially policymakers, can actually create better policy and correct some of the errors that have been made by linking policy to an illusion of what was going on instead of linking policy to the way in which that reality is being constructed by the people.
So your thesis, if I understand, is that by studying the behavior in a humanistic way, the behavior that results in the antisocial or criminal activity, you can better shape policy to address that behavior as opposed to shaping policy simply to address the end result, which is the criminal act.
Absolutely. But I would also add back to the first point that one thing I think ethnography also can show us is that at times the criminality of the subjects is constructed by the authorities, not constructed by their own activities. That we have to always look at the dynamic going on there. So, for example, my colleague Mark Ham, who I guess would be another cultural criminologist, has done deep ethnography inside the worlds of violent skinheads. Certainly, it's humanistic work in the sense that he's trying to expose the harm they do. He's certainly not sympathizing with the skinheads, but his argument was if you don't know how they organize their violence, you can't stop that violence. So from the outside, you'll only see the end result. You'll never know what led them to attack an immigrant or someone. So again, whether you're sort of whoever side you're on, I think, or maybe on no one's side, it seems the deeper the knowledge, the better we can respond to the problem. I would add one thing, though, is that I think policymakers prefer numbers to narrative reports, and so that is obviously a problem. Is that if what a politician or someone wants is give me the rate of crime in this neighborhood, then obviously ethnography is not the best approach to that. So it does have that.
Difficult to quantify.
It is. It is. Well, this is a whole other discussion. I would argue that most things are difficult to quantify. Maybe we quantify at our own risk, but it seems to serve the purpose. Yeah. Other questions? Rebuttals? Comments?
I have a quick question. Do you ever see a way of quantitative versus qualitative researchers finding that medium where they can work together? Because even in the research setting, say even at this school, you have your qualitative and your quantitative, and
right.
It's very decisive who's in each camp. Is there any way that each side can work together, or at least see what the other person is saying?
Right. I would say yes and no. I mean, if we're looking at sort of foundational assumptions about what constitutes analysis or critique or even knowledge, then clearly a more quantitative model is not just a matter of counting, it's a matter of assumptions about statistical validity and reliability, and often that becomes a kind of analysis, that here's what my statistical analysis shows. So in that sense, you're right. Those are not just different people in teaching different courses. Those are profoundly different approaches to research. On the other hand, I think what some cultural criminologists are trying to do is to say that numerical research anyway, counting and basic levels of correlation can be suggestive, can point us to issues, can show us patterns and problems that then we can investigate more deeply, as long as we don't mistake that counting and that measurement for the end result, for the analysis itself. Again, to quote my colleague Mark Ham, he's coined the term, or maybe he stole it, I don't know, but I've heard him use the term ethnostatistics. In other words, that we can certainly measure things, we can certainly count and even correlate, but within situated logics, within the larger sense of how something happens, as opposed to that only being what we do. So despite the paradigmatic differences, I think there is middle ground there, but I think in some ways it's so deeply entrenched in our discipline that, in grad school you're sort of one or the other, that it does become difficult to find that middle ground. Yeah.
Be my last question.
It's all right.
Have you done any studies with respect to geographic cultures? For instance, having been born in Louisiana, lived in Mississippi, and now live in the heart of Texas, I think there is something called the Southern culture.
I think so too.
Right. Propose that. Have you done any studies on whether there is anything inherent in the mores of the Southern culture as it might relate to certain types of crime or criminal activity or race or anything?
I have not, but Ken Tennell, who also is usually labeled a cultural criminologist, has done interesting work on that using the Southern subculture of violence hypothesis that I think many of us know, right? That Southern culture emerging out of Highland tribes and in relative isolation in the Appalachians and with certain very strict gender roles led to higher rates of crime. And Tennell has said, well, that may be true, but let's look at how that got encoded and perpetuated through music and art in the South as well. So to me, he's done some fascinating work on bluegrass music and lyrical analysis. So as you say, trying to look at sort of the symbolic environment by which each generation hands down, if there is a Southern culture, how is it that the next generation learns it? And so he's tried to say, perhaps it's handed down not just through sort of family instruction, but through art, music, rituals, storytelling, oral traditions that perpetuate it. So I think that'd be a fascinating field of research, would be to look at not just Southern culture, but other regional cultures and how they link to different types of criminality.
You mean other areas have cultures such as Southern?
Well, not as advanced as ours, but right. Other questions, comments?
Thank you all very much. I appreciate your attention. Thank you, Jeff, very much. Very engaging. Let me remind you of tomorrow's presentation. Tomorrow's presentation will be more methodological. Some of you are sitting there, I know, some of you undergraduates in particular, saying deep ethnography. I didn't even know the thing existed in layers. Come tomorrow. Come tomorrow and you'll learn more about that and a very important methodological approach. And also next week, Byron Johnson will be talking about faith-based movements, another culturally sensitive kind of an approach in our field.